Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is an historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s. You can now find Harley on his new website. It's the LaRouche Organization. I'll put all the links at the bottom of the video. And I am very happy to have Harley back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Thank you, Dave. It's really good talking to you again.
Yes, and I'm very happy to have you back on. We haven't spoken since, I think, October of last year. It's been a very long time. And since that time, we now have a new president, and it seems that they're reversing everything that Trump had done, and they put back into place the Paris Climate Accord. They're putting everything back into place. We have Klaus Schwab and others saying, okay, now it's time to bring in the Great Reset. Should people be a little nervous about this Great Reset? Because it seems like for many people, it just came out of nowhere. Those people that have been following it, I think it used to be called a conspiracy theory, but now it's turned out to be true. I mean, a lot of people heard about it. A lot of people don't know exactly what it entails. Should people be nervous about this?
I don't know that nervousness is the right thing. I think people should fight like hell to stop it. It can be defeated. And one of the things that is a problem is the way the mainstream media portrays it, is that it's going to be a natural development because of the effects of the pandemic, the effects of the global debt that's being built up by the quantitative easing, the free money coming out from the central banks. So they're trying to portray it as something that's an automatic evolutionary process. It's nothing of the sort. It's, in a sense, a part of a 50-year drift away from the United States as an industrial republic based on investment in infrastructure, in new technologies, science, and research and development. We had a real economic growth period coming out of World War II that lasted through the 60s and early 70s. But the plug was pulled on that in August of 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off gold. And as you talk about quite often, from that point forward, we had nothing but a fiat currency. So in a sense, this has been in the works for a long time. Now, the new wrinkle to it, and even this isn't so new, but how they shifted the environmental movement from Earth Day and sort of vague things about clean air, clean water, to this whole apocalyptic view, the Greta Thunberg approach, that we're all going to be dead in 10 years unless we shut down industrial economy, we stop eating meat, stop heating our homes in the winter and cooling them in the summer, stop building houses. This is the wrinkle that's been added in the last decade or so around the so-called global warming. But as I said, I mean, I can go through some of the details that we've been publishing on it. Mm-hmm. That it first became public in a big way, and it wasn't even very public. But in August of 2019, the Federal Reserve Conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, had a convergence of central bankers coordinated with BlackRock, the world's largest equity fund, Larry Fink, putting forward a proposal that they called a financial regime change. And what it entailed primarily is turning everything, every aspect of finance and economics over to central banks. And central banks are not government agencies, they're private. They essentially are there for the purpose of the largest private banks and shadow banking system. And the whole idea, the way Fink and his people presented it, is that while the central banks control monetary and credit policy, interest rates and how much money goes into circulation, elected officials through governments handle spending. And they want to turn spending policy, that is fiscal policy, over to the central banks and not allow elected representatives to have any say. Now, people are skeptical about what our elected representatives will do, but it is possible on occasion that they do respond to necessity, especially if constituents are mobilized and talking to them. They want to remove that. It's like removing elections completely. It's like the voting laws that are being rammed through the Congress right now. You won't even need to vote in the future because they're going to choose who you're electing, but they won't have any power anyway. It will be unelected technocrats working on behalf of the largest swindlers in the world running the central banks who will control everything. So I guess that is something to be nervous about, but we've got to mobilize to defeat it.
So you mentioned that they introduced the climate aspect of this, of making the world green again and getting rid of fossil fuels, oil. They want to take us off of that. I mean, we saw what happened in Texas where they had this, cold spell and everything froze and people were freezing down there and the wind turbines, they weren't turning anymore. They weren't producing enough electricity. How are they going to get around this? And will this work?
No, it won't work at all. And first of all, it's based on a fraud. Carbon dioxide is not something bad. It's plant food. We exhale carbon dioxide. The idea that they've turned this into some kind of toxic waste product is part of the fraud. They're completely transforming chemistry into an ideology and a religion. And we just had a conference where Dr. William Happer, who you may know, who Princeton physicist who President Trump appointed to the National Security Council for a while to try and convince the Congress that the whole green policy was a fraud. And Happer left after a while out of disgust because the Congress was not interested in scientific truth. But the first fraud is that there's no scientific evidence that human economic activity causes climate change. There may be variations in heat, in cold. That's something that's happened throughout history before there was a single combustion engine. You can trace it back to the early ages. There were ice ages and warming periods. There are warming periods on Mars. It's part of the solar system. It's solar radiation and so on. So that's the first fraud. But the second fraud is this idea that you can actually run an economy, a modern economy, on so-called renewable energy sources, solar, wind, geothermal. And Texas should have been a warning signal for everyone. The media tried to say, well, also the natural gas plants didn't work. That's because they were overworked to make up for what wasn't coming from the wind power.
Yep.
I live in Germany now. In Germany, there's going to be an exit from nuclear power in 2 years. All the nuclear plants will be shut down. And by the way, nuclear plants are carbon neutral anyway. Secondly, all the coal plants are going to be shut down. There's an exit from coal, and they're trying to get rid of natural gas. Now, at the same time the freeze hit Texas, we had a cold spell in Germany. What did we do for electricity here? We purchased it from Poland and the Czech Republic, both of which have coal plants that function. What happens when coal is shut down all over the world, as Sir Michael Bloomberg is trying to do? Well, we're not going to have enough electricity to support 3 to 4 billion people, much less 7 billion.
I just want to back up for 1 sec here.
Yeah.
If they shut down, I'm trying to figure out what their agenda is here. If they shut down coal, they shut down natural gas, they shut down oil. First of all, how do we drive anywhere? Second, how do we fly anywhere? How do ships run? How does the earth function? How do the people of the earth function?
Well, the people who are doing this really don't care. There are a couple of points here just to amplify what you're saying. They want to go back to a feudal era, the pre-Middle Ages, where people essentially live in decentralized villages with no central power systems, no efficient, safe, and reliable power systems, but everyone has their own water power from a stream or windmill or in the backyard or something of that sort. The idea that this was cooked up to going back to the late 60s, early 70s, that's why I say you have to go back to the environmental movement in the beginning, was that there are too many people on the planet. Too many people, not enough resources, and therefore we're going to end up with a crisis where people are going to die. This is the old idea of the Malthusian world that goes back to the British Empire, which resisted scientific advance and technological advance and kept the science in the hands of an aristocracy. Now, the American system is different. The American system, through infrastructure development, through science and technology, developed a system that could have a constant increase in raw materials based on new science, new physical principles. Oil was not a resource. If you were digging around for water in Texas in the 1830s and you hit oil, you were angry. Once we figured out how to develop systems that can use oil and use natural gas, and that's the way mankind has advanced. The real point here, Dave, is the people pushing this go back to the richest people in the world, a gang of oligarchs, of anti-scientific people haters who are trying to reduce the world's population dramatically. And I know many of your listeners are aware of that. We talk a lot about fighting what you might call satanic forces, but it really is the case. There's a hatred of human beings that exists in this aristocracy. I mean, one of the people who's at the center of the Davos crowd with this great reset is Prince Charles. He's been at every one of the Davos meetings, and Prince Charles has formed a whole series of organizations which, through Mark Carney of the bank, former chairman of the Bank of England, they've set up what they call a bankers' compact. And it's 130 of the biggest banks and financial institutions in the world, and they've already signed a pledge that they will no longer loan money to anyone, any company, any production operation that has a carbon footprint.
Yes,
in other words,
I read
you're
that.
either
Yes,
carbon neutral or you're cut off from credit.
and it's funny. This is going back to conspiracy theory. When people said no, this is not going to happen. It seems that these individuals, they're using climate, they're using the Great Reset to actually usher in the New World Order, or
a new dark age.
For us,
the New World Order is.
Yeah, well, for us, it would be a dark age. For them, you don't think they're going to be using oil, coal, natural gas to function?
Slave labor.
Yeah, and slave labor. Of course, they will be able to travel. I mean, think about the people. If we go back and we remove all of this and we depend on solar energy, wind, people won't be able to travel. You won't be able to get on a plane. You won't be able to drive a car. You won't be able to do anything. But the wealthy, if you go back in time, if you go back to king and queen and the serfs, they had the ability to do a lot, and the serfs had the ability to do nothing.
The serfs can pull the wagons.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, they're talking about getting rid of the combustion engine entirely.
Yeah.
Now, the head of Toyota Motor Company, after they tried to develop an electric car, and they developed a pretty good one, but what they said is that, do you have any idea how much environmental damage is done in mining the materials that are needed to build these batteries that can store electricity? Secondly, there's no way in the world you can get enough electrical chargers if you have everyone driving an electric car, it won't work. They're talking about getting rid of high-speed rail. They're talking about people not flying. One of the other lines coming out, especially from the British and the American scientists, is that eating meat is a major cause of climate change, and we have to give up meat. We have to give up the comfort of home heating and home cooling, as they did in Texas for those couple of days where they couldn't heat their homes and couldn't get clean water. But this is really, you mentioned that this was considered one of the wild conspiracy theories. And yet, if you go back and look at the reports coming out, going back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, go back to the banning of DDT, which led to a huge increase in the number of deaths from malaria. You look at the Meadows and Forrester report, an MIT report, The Limits of Growth. You look at Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb. All of this was going on in the 60s. At the same time, campuses were being flooded with drugs, and there was the Vietnam War, and then the change of the financial system from a productive economy to an increasingly We were outsourcing manufacturing. We were moving to a service economy. And much of this was funded by what? Debt. A huge increase in debt. If you go back, I'm sure you have some of these charts, go back to the 70s and 80s and 90s and look at the levels of debt that existed then, which people were somewhat horrified by. It's nothing compared to the amount of debt carried by private individuals now with credit cards and mortgages and car loans, the amount of student debt, the volume of corporate debt. You know, one of the things since 2008 is corporate debt has gone through the roof. And what's the debt for? A lot of it is debt that's taken on to pay interest on their debt. These are zombie corporations. They're not making money, but they're taking the free money from the Federal Reserve and they're buying their own stock so that their executives can get the bonuses that they want from the stock appreciation while the companies are being ground into the dust. So we've had a policy of the financial establishment, which is destroying the world economy. And they're the ones who are saying, okay, now we're going to save it by establishing this great reset, which I've been calling a global central bankers dictatorship. And that is really what the so-called New World Order is all about. And what's going to keep it in power? The muscle of the U.S. military, which is going to be used through NATO, through containment of Russia and China, regime change against any country that doesn't go along with this. You know, look, they're even sanctioning Germany on the Russian oil and gas pipeline. So there are no allies or friends. There's a commitment to the zero growth anti-science world. And because they can control the media and control science education, that if you say that this climate crisis is a fraud, they call you a climate denier.
Yeah.
You know, the equivalent of a Holocaust denier.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another form of censorship and the fake news. So what's happened, what actually is important to note is that this is where Obama was going and where Hillary Clinton would have gone directly into this had she been elected in 2016. They were really set back by the election of Donald Trump. You pointed out he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. Mm-hmm. Well, he also pulled us out of some of these crazy free trade deals.
Yep.
He made an effort to bring back U.S. manufacturing with getting rid of some of the regulations and the tax policies and so on so that American corporations could come back. The problem here is that the American corporations were making a lot of money from the outsourcing, and not all of them were so willing to come back. And so what could have been a huge game change had Trump been reelected, every stop was pulled to make sure that he wouldn't be back in office in 2020, because everything was set to go with this in 2016, but it was set back. And in the meantime, you look at the volumes of debt that's been created with this quantitative easing and the repo markets and the derivatives trade and everything else. There's nothing standing in the way of this unless it crashes before they get this great reset in place. Now, you know, one of the good things that's happening is that because people started figuring out over the last 4 years that these operations, it's not a conspiracy theory, but it's actually being done. There are people committed to these crazy ideas. It's harder for them to pull them off. And one of the good things, I'm sure you've heard about this, is that you have a group of states where the attorneys general have filed a suit against Biden's executive orders, the Green New Deal executive orders. There's a big fight, even in the Democratic Party, how far to go on the Green New Deal, because they know it's not popular. Americans may be snookered from time to time by the news media, but Americans still have a fundamental commitment to the idea of progress based on liberty, based on science. And if you take that away, you leave people with nothing. And in the meantime, you put people in wars, constant war, regime change wars, endless wars, so that there's an overall demoralization. And that's look, this is what Biden is moving us toward now with the China policy, the threats to Putin. Don't worry, we're going to get him. This kind of macho stuff coming from Biden. The rest of the world is looking at that and they're saying, what the hell's going on here?
Well, what I've noticed is that everything that Trump put into place, Biden had to move. He had to move at lightning speed to reverse. And I don't think it's him. He's a puppet. The puppet masters are telling him exactly what to do. And he had to create all those executive orders. I think he's way over 50 now. And he had to do all of these things. And I think a lot of people are noticing that he is doing a lot through executive orders to put everything back to the way it was before Trump came into his presidency. And what I find...
go ahead, sorry.
I just want to say, you said like this was part of their plan with Hillary Clinton. I think part of the plan was to bring us to war and to have destruction, loss of life. No one would be able to argue about the Great Reset, and they'd be able to just usher it in. But Trump came into the picture, and he actually ended a lot of the endless wars. He made peace throughout the Middle East. He actually speaks to Kim Jong-un. He went down to South Korea, North Korea, walked across the DMZ. So it seems like he kind of countered a lot of that. And then we came to the pandemic where they said the only way out of this is a vaccine. And that's not going to be developed for 2-3, years down the line, because I think they needed that time. And then all of a sudden, a vaccine was produced in 2020. And I don't think they ever expected that to happen. And
Operation Warp Speed was a phenomenal mobilization that only happened because President Trump was behind it. Mm-hmm. Now, also along this line, his commitment to reviving a space program has an enormous impact in terms of the potential for getting back to real physical goods production and new technologies in the United States. And people generally haven't paid much attention to it because the media doesn't cover it. But the warp speed and the space program are two aspects of a commitment to the traditional strengths of our economy, scientific discovery and bringing online new technologies. And on the war question, the same globalists who put in these free trade agreements that have gutted our industrial structure are the ones who put us in these wars. If you think about what the military-industrial complex is, it's not just defense contractors. It's the consulting firms. It's the various kinds of CIA contractors. But it's also Silicon Valley is incorporated now, big tech, into the war machine. The media, the fact that you have people like John Brennan, who was one of the key people running the Russiagate scam against Trump, that Brennan ends up on, MSNBC or CNN. Clapper's a consultant. They have all these people who have been proven to be liars and absolutely corrupt, and they're the ones who are coming on the media to tell us what's going on. So the war policy is an integral part of the whole shift to this Green New Deal. Now, one of the reasons for the war policy, besides the money that's made on war, but it's more than that. It goes beyond that. Two of the countries that are not going along with the Green New Deal and will not go along with the Great Reset are Russia and China. And you can say what you want about China, but the Chinese went to the last Davos meeting and said, we're all for the Green New Deal. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to have 50% of our electricity from coal and 50% from nuclear within 20 years. Now, that's not part of the Davos plan. And that's typical of Xi Jinping to say one thing, but actually have a different policy. As for Russia, Putin said, we could use some global warming in Siberia. And he spoke with the coal industry there, and he said, we're going to increase our coal production by 30%, and much of it is going to be shipped to Asian countries. And so you have much of the world that recognizes that the Green New Deal will destroy their ability to develop. And that's why we just had a conference a weekend ago at the Schiller Institute. And we had people from all around the world saying, what's going on in the United States with this Green New Deal nonsense? We want science. We want technology. We need energy. And the people of Texas say that. most of the people of the United States believe that improvements in delivery of electricity and new technologies have improved their life. So how can you have a Green New Deal which basically says we're not going to do that? And one final part of the hoax of this, Biden's next stimulus is supposedly going to be $3 trillion on infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Now, we greatly need infrastructure investment in the United States, but not green technology. They're trying to create a green bubble. And I should have mentioned this earlier. A part of the Great Reset is the fight over who's going to get the $30 to $40 trillion that's going to be put forward between central banks and the private financial system, the hedge funds, the equity firms. They're talking about a $30 to $40 trillion bubble that they're already fighting over. Who's going to get what share? And none of that is going to go in the physical economy. Nothing into new technologies, nothing into the real infrastructure we need of high-speed rail, new airports, upgrading water and power management. None of it. It's going to go into the AOC category of solar, wind power, and some crazy ideas they have about artificial intelligence. And I think they need artificial intelligence because there's not much real intelligence there.
I agree with that. When we step back and we look at this, are there different factions? Because you mentioned China, Russia, they don't want to go along with this. I mean, do we have different factions pushing different agendas? Like Davos, we have the private Western central bankers, the non-elected leaders pushing one side, and then we have Putin on another side with Xi saying, no, we don't want this. So we have different factions pushing different agendas.
Well, that's true. And even within the Western central banking group, you have a division. If you look at something, I was fascinated by what happened with this GameStop thing, because everyone was saying, well, it's the little guys going after the big guys. It's Robin Hood, steal from the rich. And then you find out that there are hedge funds on both sides. There's no honor among thieves. The swindlers who are profiting from the pandemic and profiting from the Green New Deal are going to steal from each other. And that's one of the problems they're going to have in getting a consensus. So you have factions on that side, but you have leaders in nations in the developing sector who don't have much power. They've essentially been controlled by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these, of course, are part of the Davos crowd, the globalists, who see these countries as sources of cheap labor, cheap raw materials. And these are countries where people are saying, we'd like to develop. And they will follow if Russia says, you want a coal plant, you want a nuclear plant, we'll come in and build it. These are the countries that are welcoming the Belt and Road Initiative of China because it's the only investment they're getting. So in terms of the world, there is a real factional division. Now, in terms of the United States, there's, as I say, I think a large section of the American people don't buy the whole green policy. They just don't think, especially if they're told, well, part of the green policy means you can't eat hamburgers anymore. I think that's going to be a hard one to sell in the United States, where you have to have veggie burgers.
Well, they'll give us synthetic meat.
Yeah, exactly. Made on 3D printers.
Right.
So it's not very appetizing, but it also points to the insanity of the policy. The idea that having cows is causing the universe to implode. So the question is, who's going to be able to tell the truth and get the truth out? And that's why the censorship issue is so important, fighting through that. That's why what we do, I do a daily update, a 10-minute update, where today I just went through how the Council on Foreign Relations is at the center of a lot of this. But then I think you actually reported this a couple of days ago, this new committee that's being set up in the Federal Reserve, the Financial Stability Climate Committee.
Yeah.
So what are they going to do? They're coordinating with the Global Central Bankers Climate Change Network. Well, what does that mean? They're going to try and figure out how to channel all funds into this green financial bubble. And then they'll let some of the other bubbles collapse. And this is where you see that we've got to find the small and medium enterprises that are the targets of and will be the targets of the Biden administration. We got to find people who, the technology proud farmer who is being wiped out by this corporate farming. The real enemy here, Dave, besides the central banks, is the corporate cartels. And this is not new. This goes back to the corporate cartels in the 1920s that between Wall Street and London worked in Germany to put Hitler in power. Mm. You know, this is the Bushes and the Morgans and the Montague Normans from the Bank of England, the Schroeder Bank in Germany. This is the model that Klaus Schwab is operating from, that corporations, global corporations, take power away from sovereign nations. That's why when President Trump spoke about national sovereignty, it was so important. And he went to the United Nations in, I think it was September 2019, and gave a speech where he said, he reasserted that we intend to be a sovereign nation, but we wish every nation to be sovereign. Every nation has that right. And you can have agreements between sovereign nations. You should not have supranational governments that operate through cartels that make policy. And this is why he fought against the free trade agreements. So, you know, we've got to make clear you have two different conceptions about how the world works. Either you have these self-selected elites who have power because they've been controlling central banks and they're running off printing presses and grabbing all the money, but that money is worthless. That's the key point. And if we can get back to the idea of a physical economy, whether it's gold or something similar to that, where you then generate credit into real production as opposed into bubbles, we can bankrupt them. We can bankrupt these speculative elites. And I think the one thing I regret about the 4 years of President Trump is that he didn't follow through with the idea of going back to Glass-Steagall banking separation, because he could have at that point delivered a huge blow to the hedge funds and the others who think they have a right now to invest in increasingly build up risky portfolios, and if they collapse, they'll be bailed out, because that's what Dodd-Frank does. And we could have changed that, and it would have been an enormous effort, because a lot of the Republicans are on the side of the Democrats on this. They're all Wall Street. And I think we've got to keep fighting to keep this vision of a sovereign America for the people, as opposed to one run by globalist corporate cartels.
Well, I think with everything that's going on now and people where they're waking up to the fact that things are not right. I mean, we have this president that can barely speak. He's tripping.
Barely climb stairs.
I was just going to say that. He falls upstairs, and he just had a press conference, and it was a complete and utter disaster. I think people are now seeing a lot more than they have ever seen before. Because if you really think about when Trump was in his presidency, where he cut taxes, fuel prices were very low, the market was going up, and this was before the pandemic. He was removing regulations and the trade deals. Biden, he's doing the complete opposite, putting forth a tax plan, and people had a taste of reduced taxes, and now he's creating a tax plan where it's going to hit people not making $400,000, but individuals making $200,000. So I think with everything that he's doing right now, I think people are starting to scratch their head and say, okay, wait a minute, something is off right here, and this is not what we want. And I'm wondering if this is going to have a domino effect as people start to question what is going on, especially after this press conference about the agenda of not just him, but those people controlling him. Are they going to start to question all of this and say, this is not what we want?
Why do you think there's so much censorship? Why do you think there's an attempt to silence opposition? Why do you think there are 5 or 6 legal cases going forward against Donald Trump right now? The fact that they did this rush to judgment around January 6th to impeach him as he's going out of office shows you that they're not going to let up. They're not going to stop. This kind of irregular warfare is going to continue.
But if they didn't think he was a threat, they would have never done this.
Of course not.
To me, I think of it this way. If they have to censor, hundreds of thousands of people on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, they're the ones who are panicking because we represent the people. And they're worried about the people finding out information. Even off of those social media platforms, they're still coming after the people. Even if you have a website or if you're on a different platform, they're still trying to come after you. So to me, they're panicking. They're worried.
Well, and that's because they're vulnerable. The vulnerability was shown by the fact that you had 75 million or more people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020. There's a movement out there that is not silenced, and that it may be temporarily set back. People may be demoralized, but people were awakened over those 4 years to the fact that our government has been hijacked by these special interests, that both parties are controlled by them. The institutions of government, the so-called deep state or the swamp or whatever you want to call it, the court system, there's a rottenness. And what's the rottenness there to protect? Incredible levels of debt that are being traded daily by these hedge funds, by these offshore banking institutions. The corporations line up so they can get their overnight money so they can meet their expenses the next day. This is an unsustainable system. I mean, LaRouche talked about the fact that we're heading to a systemic breakdown. The whole system's set to go. They think that they can ramp up a new bubble and buy some more time. But their main goal is not just to keep the money flowing into these exotic financial instruments. Their main goal is to reduce the population and destroy the ability of nations to fight against this global dictatorship. Now, I would say one weakness we have in the United States is that we can be manipulated around the idea of an enemy image. For many, many years, it was the Soviet Union, and then they tried to do that with Russia. But what we saw with Russiagate was that this was a fraud, that Putin wasn't doing what he was accused of, Trump wasn't doing what he was accused of. People came to realize that this was a narrative that was fabricated between British intelligence and the Obama intelligence community and the media. And so when that failed, what they're doing now is they replace Russia with China to try to whip the American people up against the Chinese. But one thing that's interesting is that what the Chinese are doing with their economy is they're not allowing a speculative system. And that's, they're protecting it with the state. Now, we wouldn't do it necessarily that way, although we have had regulations to protect against private bankers and private interests in the past. But what the Chinese are doing is they're putting their money into the physical economy and into the education of their youth. That's what we used to do. And there's no reason we can't get back to that. And the question is not necessarily to compete with the Chinese, but to revive our country, which is what President Trump ran on in his 2016 campaign. So what we do at the LaRouche organization is we're having regular conferences. We're bringing people from different parts of the world. We had people this last weekend, as I said, we had William Happer, who's really excellent. If people want to get a good sense of the fraud of the CO2 story, he did about a 12-minute presentation on it that's on our website at theschillerinstitute.com, where he just showed that all this talk about CO2 is a bunch of nonsense. But that's the kind of thing we have to do. Educational material, the kind of work you do, Dave, on a daily basis where you get out to people. The world is not what they're being told. It's very different from what they're being told by the mainstream media and the institutions. And if we can prevail by presenting not a narrative, but the truth, to show that the narratives that are being constructed are designed to make you submit to the power of these globalist cartels, well, I think we've got a really good fighting chance to reverse it.
I do too. Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people find you and get in contact with you?
Well, people can write to me at my personal email address, which is harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. And tell me that you heard me on the X22 report, and I'll send you a link to my website, which includes the daily updates that I do, 10 to 12-minute updates. And it's free. You can sign up for free for these. And I'm very happy to have communication, as I always have, with your viewers and listeners, because you have a very good audience.
No, thank you. Harley, once again, thank you very much for coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'll talk to you again soon.
Yes.